Protest and the media. What percentage of people supported the Vietnam War? What influenced people's opinions? What impact did people's opinions have on government policies? And what was the My Lai massacre? In this activity, you will have looked at a timeline and a series of notes to show what took place in Vietnam, and you should be able to assess the impact this had on the US government. Your first task will be to use the information sheets dotted around the room to collect the information and compile that on your timeline. You should note down the following information: key events, opinion poll information, which will allow us to quantify the views of the American public, and events and reactions to those events in the United States. You may possibly be able to identify the most important year from the work you've done. The key events in Vietnam between 1965 and 1971. In February 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began. 70% of the American public at this stage supported the war in Vietnam, with the strongest support, coincidentally, being amongst the 21 to 30-year-old demographic group, that group most likely to get drafted into the Vietnam War. At this point, 3,000 men were being drafted a month to compensate for the diversion of troops to Vietnam. By October of that year, however, this had reached 33,000. By 1967, fewer than 10% of the people wanted an immediate withdrawal of US troops from Vietnam, yet at this stage, Johnson must have been considering his position. In March 1967, 100,000 protesters marched against the war, though this should be set against the context of even bigger marches and protests for the civil rights movement. In 1968, 46% of the population still approved of Johnson's handling of the war. 50% believed that it was vital to contain communism in South Vietnam. But then, of course, we have the Tet Offensive and the role of the media. NBC broadcast the famous shooting of the captured member of the VC by the head of Saigon police. This was seen by 20 million viewers. In February 1968, the draft was extended to include students at university, and in March of that year, the My Lai massacre happened, but was subsequently covered up. By 1968, 20% of the US population had switched from support to opposition to the war, and in May of 1968, the highest number of US soldiers were killed in a single month, at 562. By 1969, the counterculture protest movement was at its highest. Woodstock was populated by numerous anti-war songs. In April 1969, 2 million people in 200 cities protested for a peace settlement. Compare that to the 100,000 in 1967. 80% of the people supported Nixon's attempts to find a peace settlement, though please note this would have been on America's terms and not a capitulation or immediate withdrawal. And in November, the My Lai massacre was uncovered. Images were printed and broadcast showing women and children murdered by US soldiers. In 1970, protests at Kent State University led to the shooting of 4 students. People blamed the government as they had a right to protest, and in 1971, veterans protested in Washington, D.C., 300,000 of them throwing away their medals. Using the information that I will now go through, please add to your notes, either on your timeline or using the format suggested here, or an alternative of your preference, focusing particularly on the following: opposition in the United States to the war, the changing levels of support from Congress, what and the impact of the My Lai massacre, and the increasing financial costs of the war. The draft. The government was forced to draft or conscript many more men into the armed forces. Remember, at this point, America's global commitments are vast. Only 3,000 men a month had been needed in February 1965, but this had increased to 33,000 by October of that year. Those who avoided the call-up were called draft dodgers. Many burnt or tore up their draft papers. Many others fled to Canada or Europe to escape the draft. Muhammad Ali, most famously the world heavyweight boxing champion, even had his title taken away from him after resisting the draft. There was widespread resentment, as many educated and affluent Americans could find legitimate ways of avoiding the draft, whilst many poor Americans and black Americans were unable to do this. Make love, not war. Many Americans were increasingly saying that the war was immoral, that the US government had no right to impose its views on a poor nation like Vietnam. The protests were strongest amongst young people. Remember, earlier on, they had been particularly committed to the war. This, however, was also part of a wider counterculture. The time of the miniskirts and punk rock, exotic hairstyles, the civil rights movement, race riots, drug abuse, and the huge outdoor festival that was Woodstock in '69. Many teenagers dropped out of society. The hippies told people to make love and not war. It is the only meaningful response to Vietnam, they said. Death in the opinion polls. As the fighting intensified, hundreds of American soldiers were killed in action, many of them in their teens. In 1968, May of that year, 562 soldiers were killed in a single week of fighting. 5,500 VC also died, but this was no consolation to grieving relatives in the United States, who were also voters. There were also demonstrations in favour of the war too. At the start of 1968, a Gallup poll showed that 46% of the American population still overwhelmingly approved of the president's handling of the war, and that additionally 50% believed it was essential that South Vietnam should be a bulwark against containing communism. Even this isn't indicating that the other 50% were against the war or determined for an American pullout. It's a sliding scale of opposition. In 1971, 300,000 veterans took part in a march on Washington, one of the most significant and moving demonstrations against the war because the protesters had actually fought in the conflict themselves. Many were heroes, some were on crutches and wore their old uniforms. When they threw away their decorations, medals, ribbons, and honours they had been given for fighting in the war, many Americans were deeply shocked. All of this being broadcast by the media. The media played an important part in exaggerating and exciting the protest movement. The war in Vietnam was the first to be covered night after night on television. Satellite and broadcasting technologies had improved. The war was fought live in American living rooms. It made the people viewing at home realize what was being done in Vietnam in their name. Photographs in magazines and newspapers had a similar impact. No previous war had ever been fought so freely with media access. Two images in particularly affected the way that people thought about the war. One was the photograph showing the screaming Vietnamese children after a napalm attack on their village. The other showed the cold-blooded execution of a VC officer in the street. Both of these were watched live on television by millions of viewers. The media was also accused of being one-sided. US Army commanders and many officers and soldiers were dismayed at media coverage of the war, and even blamed television and the press for weakening the American stance in Vietnam. There was little media coverage of the war from the communist perspective. Reporters could not go out on patrol with the NVA or Viet Cong units to describe their failures and report on their war crimes. It was much easier to follow the Americans. North Vietnamese atrocities such as the cutting off the heads and genitalia of US soldiers killed in action were rarely shown, talked about, or broadcast. Therefore, the newsreel sequences screened in North Vietnam were very one-sided. They showed the world what Ho Chi Minh wanted them to see, a peasant nation bravely resisting the might of America. Now we need to further investigate the support from Congress. Please be aware when we're doing this, the numbers involved. 2 senators represent every US state, whilst the House of Representatives is more balanced and based upon the population rates. In August '64, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed. The House of Representatives provided no opposition whatsoever to this. In the Senate, 2 voted against it. The resolution gave Johnson the power to take all necessary measures to repel armed attacks against the forces of the US and prevent further aggression. In 1967, Senator William Fulbright, who had proposed this resolution, turned against the White House policy and organised televised debates against the war to mobilise opposition. This is interesting in itself, as it was designed to mobilise, to create an opposition. An example maybe of the tail wagging the dog, rather than the dog wagging the tail. George Kennan, who came up with a policy of containment in the late 40s, stated also that the Vietnam was not vital to US interests. By 1967, there were 12 senators openly opposed to the war. After the Tet Offensive, General Westmoreland's request for an additional 200,000 troops was not given. By 1971, under Nixon, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was repealed. Further amendments forbid intervention in Laos and Cambodia. And in April to July, on 17 occasions, further restrictions to the President's freedom of actions in Southeast Asia were passed by Congress. What had been Johnson's liberty to do with what he wanted in Vietnam was rapidly reined in under Nixon after Johnson's departure. The My Lai Massacre. Soon after dawn on Saturday, the 16th of March 1968, 9 large black helicopters landed close to the small Vietnamese village of My Lai. The village consisted mainly of thatch-covered red brick houses next to a minor road set amongst hedges, bamboo trees, and a paddy field. About 700 inhabitants lived there at the time the Americans came. 3 platoons of American soldiers left their helicopters on a search and destroy mission. One of the platoons, led by Lieutenant William Cayley, spent the next few hours also killing in cold blood a large number of unarmed Vietnamese men, women, and children. The villagers were assumed to be sympathizers of the VC. Although the My Lai massacre took place in March 1968, the tragedy did not come to light until 18 months later. As the evidence of the massacre flooded out, some of the soldiers concerned expressed remorse for their actions. Some shifted blame onto others, whilst a few others acknowledged their guilt. Most said they were only obeying orders, even though US Army instructions clearly stated that a soldier had a duty to disobey any orders which a man of ordinary sense and understanding would know to be illegal. Paul Malido, when asked why, replied, "I felt I was doing the right thing, because like I said, I lost buddies in the fighting." Most Americans were horrified, and public pressure started to take it. Exactly how many Vietnamese civilians were killed was never determined. Official estimates put the number at not less than 175, whilst it could have been as high as 400 or 500. Most of those responsible were never brought to justice. Lieutenant Calley argued, "We weren't in My Lai to kill human beings. We were there to destroy communism." Sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labour, but he came out of prison in 1974 after only 3 years. Finally, financial and economic problems. The war cost a great deal of money and distorted the economy. One should not forget that America is also pursuing a global arms race against communism at the time. President Johnson was additionally following his domestic Great Society program, and additionally America was pouring billions of dollars into the space race. Johnson did not want to admit how much he was spending. Congress had to cut off payments for his Great Society programs. This money was diverted into the Vietnam War. Johnson was therefore slow to ask for the necessary wartime tax rises, remembering that tax hikes are unpopular. In 1965, the government deficit had been $1.6 billion. By 1968, it was $25.3 billion. This is the start of the end of America's economic paramountcy in the world. Such deficits caused inflation and endangered America's economic well-being. The Treasury warned him that this should not go on, and taxpayers grew resentful, increasing the pressure on him to change direction in Vietnam.